we're talking about LinkedIn's Homebrew JavaScript. My name is Jakob Heuser. I'm a web developer here. And
I'm Matt. I'm a web developer as well.
Of course, all the slides are available via go/JS2012, where you can get all this and more, including any presentations you may have missed. There's a group of people that are actually streaming this. Hopefully they got lunch, they went to their desks, and are tuning in for an exciting presentation on all of our custom JavaScript. So a little bit about what we're going to go over today. The first thing we're going to be talking about is kind of the prerequisites, what we hope you've covered through other JS bootcamp sessions before you got here today. We'll go over the history of LinkedIn's Homebrew, a little bit about JS control, which is kind of the crux of one of our biggest JavaScript proprietary pieces of code and how it works, why it came to be, how to use it, how to actually use existing ones, how to build new ones. We'll then go over our helper library, which has pretty much anything you could want to do to the document by this point. It contains about 4 or 5 years of just LinkedIn JavaScript knowledge. We'll talk about what's coming soon and how we're actually planning on getting rid of all of that stuff and kind of why 8.5 years of proprietary JavaScript has been a bad idea. And then at the end, we'll also be taking questions. So throughout the presentation, if people have questions, we have a Q&A mic stand there in the middle, which is live. What we'll do is we'll pause at the end of each section for questions. So if something pops up in your head while we're bringing up these slides, jump on over to the mic, especially you, Alex, and we'll just pause at these really cool slides and we'll take questions and kind of move through that. And we'll kind of feel it out as we go. Because this is a lot of kind of custom LinkedIn stuff, people may have seen things or may have had questions about JavaScript that they've seen just working on different applications around LinkedIn. So hopefully the Q&A at the end will also provide an opportunity to answer all of that. So everyone here, of course, has been attending numerous JS bootcamp sessions, I hope. We'll pretend. Hopefully you attended the JavaScript 101 session that kicked everything off. Kind of what is JavaScript, how does it work? There were 2 other presentations about DOM events and DOM scripting, which are also pretty relevant. We're going to make an assumption that everyone's kind of seen those. This way, you know, worst case scenario, you can always go reference the slide decks, look it up, and see what's been done. So with that, let's actually dive into the history of JavaScript. So way back when, we'll say about 4 years ago, in the beginning, we used to do script tags in the page somewhere or as a standalone JavaScript file, which would call getElementById, myDiv, and then we would just do a bunch of inline JavaScript to make it do whatever it needed to do. Libraries hadn't really grown a lot back then. jQuery had show, hide. That was about it back then. That's all anyone ever used it for. YUI was this neat, nifty thing that came from the big Yahoo down south, and everyone was like, wow, this is great, but what do we do? Well, what we did back then was JavaScript wasn't very prominent at LinkedIn. So we ended up using JavaScript on an as-needed basis throughout our various pages. We eventually got a little smarter and said, well, if we move this stuff to external script tags, so if we take these script tags, pull out the code, in this case the script tag is just there so the syntax highlighting works. What if we gave everything a class of, say, dialog? And then we could say, get all of the dialogues on the page by using document.getElementsByClassName. That actually worked really well until we had dialogues and carousels and selects and all of these different class names. It turns out that doing a bunch of getElementsByClassName ends up being really expensive in the document. The homepage at the time had somewhere around 300, 350 getElementByClassName references as it tried to set up various things. So while you could say, well, this is a dialog, you still didn't really have a good way to configure it. Did you add more classes? Did you use the markup? There was really no consistent interface. So someone asked, shortly before I was hired back about 3.5 years ago, why don't we have a single system that finds all these controls and instantiates them using a common API? And we did actually hire that person. It was just literally months before I had joined on. What we ended up creating was JS control. A little bit of trivia, it was originally called Leo control. So what it is a shared TMPL tag, and we'll dive into what that actually is. It allows us to tag a DOM node as control X, like this is a carousel. It allows us to set up the config and say these are the properties of this carousel. It allows us to get rid of the dozens of by class name calls that we used to have. Now we could just say find all of the controls, and from all of the controls instantiate the proper object, reducing us down to one search of the DOM. So let's talk about JS control itself. JS control is a custom tag in shared TMPL. Most everyone here, I believe, is either web dev or JavaScript. Is there anyone that's not familiar with where JS control is, or sorry, where shared TMPL is, just as far as locations go? Couple hands, cool. So shared TMPL is a set of reusable JSP tags that are available to every front-end application on the site. They're located in the UI directory under, I believe, it's either UI shared or UI Chrome. What they are is a collection of just custom tags LinkedIn has built, of which one of those is JS control. It allows us to identify the HTML in a non-blocking manner, because when you use the JS control tag in JSP, which we'll show on a couple slides out here, you write some content at the beginning of the tag, you write some content at the end of the tag. This actually will then compile down into relevant Java code and will output the template. What we do is the JS control system consists of that tag there and some actual JavaScript that's going to locate the custom output we just wrote and say, oh, that's a carousel, or that's a drop-down list, or whatever interactive behavior that is, and will then instantiate the JavaScript. So what we're going to do is we're going to dive in to the actual control. And this is a little small, unfortunately. So let me see if I can punch up the size here. It's a little better. Cool. So what we're looking at here is a JS control. This is in a JSP. This happens to be the business pages, company pages follow button. So the follow button has two URLs for toggling starting and stopping following. And when you use that JS control, the second block is the output that you get. So there's a URL link with biz company pages follow company. And then you see that extra stuff that got written out after the tag. That's what gets done by our template language. So when you close that JS control tag, it writes out a script tag with a type, which is, in this case, biz pages company follow, and then adds the config information. The JavaScript can then look for all the script tags on the page of type LinkedIn/control, and it then knows where all the controls are on the page. It knows how to configure them and can do all of the instantiation in a single pass. So like I was just saying, shared TMPL has a counter. So the first time we use a JS control, that script tag gets control-1, then 2, then 3, etc. And then on the closing tag, the shared TMPL outputs all of that extra markup. The type of LinkedIn control is a way we ensure the script doesn't run. Way back when, it used to be of type text/JavaScript, and we had them smattered throughout the page, and it turned out it hurt the page performance because you'd spend some time rendering the page, run some JavaScript, render some more page, run some JavaScript. By making it of type LinkedIn control, that MIME type doesn't run. So if you ever view source on LinkedIn.com, you'll actually see a lot of script nodes of type LinkedIn control, and that's all of our interactive behavior throughout the site. So there's actually a really long list of reusable components that have been built up over the last 4 years here at LinkedIn. You've got type aheads, accordions, jelly beans, dialogues, the list goes on and on and on. They're all located under the network directory in content static JS util. So if you're ever wondering where interactive stuff is, it's always in the content static JS directory. Everything that's reusable sits in util. And there's a list. This is actually a very short list. if you go browse that directory, you can see pretty much a control for everything by this point, because over 4 years, just through various designs and iterations, we've had to build everything from infinite scrolling to custom modals to in-product like marketing, where you can view one call out, you click next, and another call out appears somewhere on the application. All that stuff has been built. So let's say you want to you get a comp from a designer, or your product manager says, hey, we need to implement this. I've seen it somewhere before. If it's on LinkedIn, there's a control for it, and we just have to find it. So let's say that you want some placeholder text. You browse through util, and there's a thing called ghostlabel.js in content static JS util. You'll actually notice the entire rest of the slide here is a bunch of comments. Everything in util has a pretty high level of documentation. We use a JS doc block, and what this ends up telling us is this control, it works with input type text and text area tags. It adds a class of ghost, which will hide the label while the page is loading. There's an example in the code that shows a form param label from the param framework being wrapped, so how you would use it. And 2 of the 3 web developers named Matt have worked on this file if we get stuck. So there's a whole bunch of information in that doc block there. We keep it really up to date. So for those that have worked through Java code and you get stuck on something and you come across that doc block tag that's got the @author line, and that guy actually did write the stuff you're looking at, and somebody can answer your question, it's a great feeling. We try and make sure everything in util gives people those great feelings. So when you're looking through the comments in the utils, you can get a sense of how it works, get examples. Most of the examples even use JSP tags instead of actual rendered HTML. So let's take our actual markup. We said that it works with a label and an input of type text. So we will start with a label and an input type text. And since it says we wrap the label, we put the JS control around the label. And we say JS control name equals ghost label. That's it. All right, we're done. We can go home now. No. Sometimes you might have to build something yourself. Most of the time, it's going to be as easy as that. It's going to be find something in util, add the config, put it around your tag, and you get the interactive behavior you're looking for. It is an occasional thing that you'll have something very, very complex, which is application specific. So let's talk about how to build something. So let's actually pull up an example. Are there any engineers here that have worked on the search products at all? Search front end? Has anyone used search? That's probably a good example. So you remember all the checkboxes down that left-hand side that do the facets? That interactive behavior, when it was originally built 2 years ago, wasn't used anywhere else on the site. It started out as an application-specific control. When you're trying to figure out whether or not you should build something, a couple questions to ask yourself. First, you've gone through the content static JS util directory and you found nothing useful. You couldn't find anything on LinkedIn.com that looked like what you were trying to do, which means we may not have it. The last thing is you've asked at least one web developer, UI person, or emailed UED web dev, or asked in the Jabber chat room. With 54 web developers working across the company, everyone's very vocal about what they're working on and if it overlaps. So if you come across some new functionality you might be building, there's a high likelihood that another web developer 2 buildings away is actually building the exact same thing. And you can save yourselves a lot of time by just saying, okay, let's use the same code. Everyone there is really chatty, so it's actually a good opportunity to ask if you come across something and say, hey, I'm trying to build X. It might be that actually there is a util that does it, or there is code already on LinkedIn.com that does it. The web dev team's pretty knowledgeable about what's been built everywhere just because they touch so much of the front end of the site. So that becomes a really good resource for figuring out whether or not we need something custom. The next thing that you do is you name the control and you place the file. App-specific controls go in content static JS/apps. They're usually named after their application. So any profile-specific JS controls are in content static JS apps profile/control name. They're not likely to be used in multiple places. Sometimes they're being built impossibly quickly because a product manager might say, well, when do we need this? And the PM says, oh, we needed it 3 weeks ago. Can you do it by 6 p.m. tonight? Sometimes those are necessity. When that's the case, putting it in the apps directory is a signal that this is meant for my application and nothing else. Our goal, of course, is if we have to build something custom to figure out how to get it into util. Something that's taken a bit of foresight, a bit of planning to be used in multiple apps, multiple places. It gives us time to think through the API, collect feedback, and things in util we're willing to maintain and help evolve. So util becomes a lot more powerful because it opens it up to all of LinkedIn. But it also has a bit of cost in terms of maintaining it because the goal is for everyone to be able to use it. So in this case, for this example, we're going to do an app-specific control. So it's content static JS apps, my app control name. We put a doc block up at the top, has a class and author line, and a couple lines about the constructor and parameters. When you set it up, there's an li namespace already defined for you. You can do li.myappControlName equals function elconfig. So we're using an anonymous function, and we're assigning that to the li.myappControlName namespace. Anyone who uses a JS control and they set the name parameter to myappControlName, it will instantiate one of these as long as it's on the page. In the constructor, there's two parameters that come into your custom control, el and config. We use el and config by convention. They could be anything you want, but we kind of prefer el and config because that's what they always are. The first parameter is the element. So if you remember back to our ghost label example, we wrap the label in the JS control tag. That label node is what gets passed in as el. If you have a config, so when you do JS control, you pass the config attribute, whatever's in the config, that JSON object, gets passed in as the second parameter, as config. That allows you to then set up your control. So in the control is where you do all of your logic for instantiation. You do all of your events. Basically, all of the meat of the control sits in the constructor or any prototype or helper methods that have been attached to the object itself. LinkedIn tends to use a pretty flat file hierarchy, so there's not really a whole lot of inheritance that goes on. There's just that common interface of el config, and things work as needed with each other. For doing the guts of this stuff, you're going to have weird operations, weird behavior, stuff like that. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt to talk a little bit about the helper functions and kind of how you actually can do some of the stuff. So showing, hiding, cookies, all that kind of behavior. There's a helper library already built for it.
Cool. Yeah, so inside of all the JS controls, you're going to see a lot of stuff using YUI2. I think a very large majority of the controls use UE2. We'll eventually move over to jQuery, but that's later in the talk. And there's also stuff that's inside of helps.js. And what that is it's a lot of common stuff. Actually, I think the next slide will talk about it. Yeah, a lot of common stuff that basically sits on top of YUI that allows for doing things like with cookies, Ajax, updating the UI, working through the DOM. And so I wanted to run over kind of what that stuff is and what it's actually doing. So the first is like working through the UI. Say you want to show, hide, toggle stuff. You can call these methods, pass in elements, and it will set display block none, display block, and jump through things like that. You can work with injecting a global alert into the page for error messaging, success messaging, all that sort of things, and it will inherit the default CSS. You can do things like fade an element in and out, highlight it, grow it, and there's something called li.scroll window, which when past a node, it will try to find the XY coordinates of that node on the page and scroll the element up to it. And so that's a lot of the helper stuff for the UI. Next up is working with the DOM. So with JS control, it's really centered around a DOM node, like Jakob mentioned. So you're probably going to end up doing a lot of stuff with that DOM node. Some of those things are like reading data attributes off of it for passing in different variables that may not be in your JSON config. You can do li.domify, which will try to take a large chunk, a string HTML, and turn that into an actual working set of DOM nodes. You have things for getting the box model height, which, you know, when you're trying to calculate the layout of a node on the page, and like where to move things to, or how to load in a spinner to update the UI, that's very helpful. So other things like checking to see if an element is in the viewport, and the show all deferred images. So this is a helper that basically whenever you load the page, you want to load in images. You might want to lazy load them so it doesn't slow down the page, so your CSS, your JavaScript can render. This guy will toggle stuff back on. So a lot of things that work with pulling in content from other places via Ajax, or maybe that content's already hidden somewhere and it injects it in the page. You'll see this guy used a lot. And then finally, toggle class, which is really helpful for if you've got a set of CSS that's already been defined somewhere. You can work with inside your JS control to toggle classes on that control, which may add a spinner or update the styling to work with like global messaging or something like that. And so that's all the helpers inside of the DOM. And again, these kind of sit on top of YUI, but it's a lot of what you'll see inside all the JS controls. And so part of JS controls is you want to get data. You might want to work with data. You might want to build a JS control to submit a form or something like that. So we've got some helpers to make XHR requests, which is built out of async requests and get remote content. So get remote content is the really simple one. Kind of pass it a URL and you pass it a callback, and it will basically make the Ajax request for you, wait for the right status updates and response codes, and then pipe that content back into your callback, which you can kind of decide what to do. Async requests allows for a little bit more like kind of flexibility. So if you need to define extra headers, if you need to have callbacks for failure codes, you can even pass in a form, and it will try to take all the form values and make an Ajax request out of that, and pull in the HTML and inject it back into the page later. And then two of the other kind of helper methods that is useful when working with asynchronous data is full page, which will check to make sure that the response from some frontier endpoint returns back just the Ajax data instead of like an entire page, because that might be an error. You might want to have a different flow through your code if that's the case. An HTML encode and HTML unencode, which helps with some of the cross-site scripting stuff, because you might want to escape any script tags or something that you're injecting in the page, and show those as actual script tags instead of running them in through the DOM. And finally, we've got cookies. Cookies are useful you can grab the session ID for making Ajax requests. You can grab basically everything that's in the cookie. You can look for overrides, that sort of stuff. And formatting. So these guys are not IETNN safe, but they are helpful to have. And actually, time formatter, you can pass in an IETNN object literal with the mappings for how to parse stuff, but it's pretty limited. But these are helpful if you're trying to output, like you have a JS control for like counting the amount of characters in a text box or something, and you want to say you have 1,000 remaining. This guy will output it correctly. Same with time format. And when working with URLs and forms, so these are a couple of helpers for obviously working with URLs and forms. And it's really nice because there's not a lot of this native stuff in vanilla JavaScript or in YUI. So these exist to add a form before you pass it into li.async request, pass it in to get remote content. Or you can read stuff off the query string and kind of make flow decisions throughout your control via that. Although probably more commonly you'd pass it in as a config to the JS control. But nevertheless, they exist. And next up, kind of the MISC stuff. This is really helpful for when trying to work with all the data. It kind of allows you to process the certain data types in a much more succinct way. Like li.each will iterate over an array, and it takes a callback that will be executed on each element of the array, and it allows you to get some kind of scope all the stuff inside of that. So you end up not writing a lot of for loops, while loops, and that sort of thing. And it also maps to a native implementation, which can be really fast in the browsers that support it. And same thing goes for li.indexOf. It's really great for looking for certain elements inside of that array just to see if they exist. Say you have a set of characters, you want to see if B is in it. You can do that. And li.later literally maps to set timeout. But it adds a bit of an abstraction to it, so we can map that to something else later down the road. Like your JS control could provide li.later and set inject an alert, and then call your callback function later if that's something you wanted to do. So that's kind of the stuff you'll see inside of JS controls when you work with them. When you want to write a new one, you want to modify one, just a quick way of doing stuff. But you might ask, doesn't jQuery do all this? Actually, quick poll. How many people have used jQuery here? All right, cool. How many people have used YUI on personal projects outside of? OK, cool. Yeah, so a lot of what we just went over is kind of, like you can do it in YUI. Obviously, they map to all YUI functions. There's some vanilla JS stuff in there, too. But also, jQuery is really great for working with the DOM, working with events, doing AJAX stuff. So you might be wondering how helps.js is going to fit in once we move over to jQuery. And let's jump into that. So in looking forward into the future, we're dumping YUI, and we're moving towards jQuery. Yay. The first goal is to try and get them running at the same time, which is really important because all of our JS controls are written using YUI. So a couple of steps, we got to take some common ones, maybe some uncommon ones first, port them over to jQuery, figure out kind of what we like, what that means for helps.js, what that means for instantiating controls on the page, and all that sort of thing. ETA is Q3, so it's coming soon. So what is that? So OK, we're gonna replace JS control. We've got jQuery coming down the pipeline. Makes a lot of things easier. Makes development much quicker. And so we were kind of thinking JS control is it's proprietary. It sits inside of our share.tmpl file. It cannot be, if you want to use it on anything outside of Frontier or Leo, you have to port it over to those other stacks. It really is not, it is not aged well, to put it nicely. So what we want to do is we want to build something that's reusable, that can be used anywhere inside of any templating language, and that we could potentially open source too. And what that means is we've got things like inject, and coming up in the next slide, we've got something called Loo. But real quick, inject is kind of like this common JS compliant loader, which is really nice because you can specify an individual kind of module to load in, which you could kind of think of it as how JS control almost works. You specify a control that you want to use, and you can load it in, and it'll handle that. It also will sandbox the code so you don't have any namespace collisions. You don't have to worry about any code getting out of hand and throwing errors and messing up your other code. And it will do a couple of performance-related things for like storing things in local storage, not loading in dependencies multiple times, that sort of thing. And it actually works really nicely with what we're calling Loo, which is where we're kind of moving JS controls to. So Loo is a way to define modular components through markup. And actually, let's just jump into the example. I kind of already talked over some of this stuff, because I think the example code will make a lot more sense. So can you all see this? So what's important here is we have these new attributes that are now going to sit on your HTML elements, prefixed with data, which is HTML5 for data set. And they all have -loo in it. And so what's going to happen is Loo is going to kind of search through the page, looking for all these attributes on your elements. And these all map to controls that are predefined by Lua. So you can kind of see the similarity between Lua's looking for the controls you specify in your elements, which is where your JS control comes in. And then the name inside the JS control will map into the value for this guy. And Lua also has the ability to pass in config values. And I think my favorite thing about this is a lot of this stuff, they're going to be kind of, they're really simple controls that do things well, and they communicate with other controls. And when you apply that all together, you can do really powerful things. So we've got a carousel up here in our outer div, and we've got button previous and button next. Button next and button previous by themselves emit just one event. They don't really do anything for you, but when tied together with a carousel will listen for those types of events and move through the carousel, which I think is very cool. And so under the hood, we've got the data-Lua. Lua will find that, will require in the control that it needs using inject. Inject handles the loading of the dependencies, so like if carousel needs like a loader control or some other type of control, it's all defined, and it will pull it in. And it will instantiate that control for the markup you pass in. And it also it provides kind of an API using jQuery's custom events for sending events inside of each control to other controls, which is not something we really support with JS Control today. And I believe that's it.
Yeah, it was kind of a rush through a bunch of slides. I didn't see anyone come up to the microphone, so we've gone over a lot of code, and I know people have questions, so please find your way to the microphone, and what we'll do is we'll page back as well, and we'll jump over to whatever slides if they're relevant. Take us away.
Can you tell us where you're at on the deployment and release of Lua, and when it can be used in?
Do you want to handle it? Yeah.
Sure. So Lua itself, as far as the two roadmaps, so Inject is at 0.4, which has cross-domain support, which supports our CDN, and has been added to, we have an application in trunk called Demo. So if you ever want to deploy demo-war locally, you can then go to your box on like Quick Deploy or something like that, /demo, and you can see the front-end code that we've developed to date. So Inject is up and running, and Lua is actually at a near stable point. So they're starting to add Carousel and I believe Tooltip are the next two implementations on that demo app. So if you want to know what's available or what's been implemented, that's usually the best source of truth. I actually think that some of the projects that are coming down the pipe that are beginning their work right now are candidates for it. I believe College Pages might be the first just because they're the most experimental. So once we have that online, though, the first big step is running jQuery and YUI side by side. Once we've got that, then we can start introducing these other dependencies onto the page. We just had to find a way to add them both without slowing the page down, because Brent's team kind of depends very heavily on a fast-performing homepage. So that's kind of where they're at right now. I think they're probably going to drop in Q3. At least jQuery for sure is Q3. And then we should be able to begin ramping some products on Lua plus Inject and start doing those in Q3 as well. So, and that will be the eventual deprecation of JS Control. Cool. More questions? Or from streaming, because I'm sure IT can shout stuff out if something comes up. All right. Are there questions on the code itself? So we actually went over the shared TMPL stuff. So we got into some stuff that wasn't JavaScript based, that was more in the TMPL stuff. And that interaction with JSPs actually does kind of impact front-end engineering. So for people that are working outside of the Frontier stack, especially if you're working in like the Grails or the Darwin environment, you've had to at some point implement the JS control library itself. So for those that have questions about the tag, now is a good time to speak. We can go into a little bit of the JSP stuff too. All right, well, it's 12:44, so we are well ahead of schedule. Thank you everyone for coming. These slides will be up on go/JS2012. And if you have any questions, just grab your nearest web developer. So pretty much everyone's familiar with the JS control system. and they can always get you in a good place. So that's usually a good resource. Thanks a lot for coming.